Welcome to Moonlight Audio, where mysteries unfold in candlelight and stories whisper through the stillness of night. Tonight, we draw the final curtain on a tale stitched in secrecy and sorrow. Join us as we conclude our journey into the haunting legacy of a forgotten tailor's guild, where every thread bore witness to betrayal, friendship, and flame. This is Hercule Poirot, the Tailor of Blood Street. It began on a rain-slicked morning in the Montmartre district of Paris, when the pale fingers of dawn had only just started to unlace the night. The street lamps still burned amber on the cobblestones of Rue Sangliers, a narrow lane wedged between forgotten bakeries and withered boutiques, where the smell of fresh dye and old secrets lingered in the morning fog. There, at number 17, the modest shopfront bore the name, El Habit Parfait, Tailor de Prestige. Behind the frosted glass and deep red curtains, no tape measure fluttered. No iron hissed. No shears snipped. Instead, silence reigned. And within that silence, a body. Inspector Jules Moreau stood motionless, a bead of sweat running down the side of his temple despite the cold. The scent of starch and old cologne clung to the air. A single gas lamp flickered in the corner, casting long shadows over the lifeless form of M. Henri Vallon, the famed tailor of Blood Street. He lay on his back atop a cutting table, arms folded unnaturally across his chest, as if stitched into rest. A pristine white suit jacket was draped over him, buttoned, tailored, and finished. Only the thread that bound his wrists together broke the illusion of peace. Bright red thread. Almost arterial. 3 hours later, Hercule Poirot arrived at the scene. The great detective, dressed immaculately in dove grey with gloves and cane, entered without a word. He paused in the threshold, sniffed once, and allowed his gaze to sweep the room. He saw it all at once, the chalk lines on the wooden floorboards, the spools of silk arranged by shade and tension, the thin layer of dust on the third mannequin, untouched for weeks. And, most notably, the measuring tape, precisely cut in two, dangling from the tailor's neck like a broken necklace. Poirot did not speak for some time. And when he did, it was only this. The cut was not hurried. It was ceremonial. Outside, the city buzzed with apathy. The morning edition had not yet reached the cafes. The world, it seemed, had not noticed the death of a man who had once tailored garments for generals and ghosts alike. But inside that shop, something ancient stirred. Poirot examined the room inch by inch. No sign of forced entry. No valuables missing. No signs of a struggle. Only the jacket. Perfectly stitched. Custom fitted. Buttoned over a corpse. Inspector Moreau shook his head. It's as if he dressed himself for death. Poirot arched an eyebrow. Non, mon ami. He was dressed for performance. The next clue came not from the scene but from the fabric. Under the left sleeve of the jacket, Poirot found a single tag sewn into the lining. A tag not belonging to Vallon's usual brand. It read, R 1894 in thread so faint, it could be mistaken for wear. Poirot stared at it. Ah, he whispered. Or perhaps, Rue. He stepped back, hands folded behind him. What do we know of M. Vallon's clients? Moreau consulted a small notepad. He worked for theatre companies, a few political families, artists, bohemians, nobles with eccentric tastes. No known enemies. Poirot turned slowly. But garments tell their own truths, yes? And this one tells me, the killer wished to speak. By afternoon, the rain had stopped. The police cordoned off the shop, but word had begun to trickle through the local grapevine. By sunset, whispers of the tailor phantom, the ghost tailor, floated from wine bars to back alleys. Poirot returned to his flat, not to rest, but to remember. He opened an old notebook. Inside, an address from nearly 3 decades ago, Rue des Brodeus, 1894. A tailor's guild. Disbanded. Lost to time. And a murder case from 1894. Unsolved. A tailor drowned in his own dye vat, red as wine. Poirot stared at the journal entry until the words blurred. Then he whispered to the silence. Thread by thread, this killer has stitched a message across the decades. And with that, he folded the notebook closed, stood from his chair, and murmured, "It is time to visit the past." The morning after the murder, Hercule Poirot stood once more at the edge of Rue Sangliers, his silhouette cast in sharp relief by the soft gold of early sunlight. This time, he did not enter the tailor's shop. Instead, he observed it from the opposite side of the street, as if it were a stage set awaiting its final act. Paris had already begun to move past the death. Shopkeepers opened shutters. Children skipped along the pavement with yesterday's rain still clinging to their boots. And yet, inside number 17, the air remained heavy. Poirot, however, was focused elsewhere. He was tracing a map of memory. By noon, he stood outside a crumbling doorway on Rue des Brodeus, the once proud street of stitchers and seamsters that had fed the fashion elite of Paris during its Belle Epoque. Now it was forgotten, its windows blind with dust, its storefronts peeling like ancient wallpaper. The number 12 had nearly faded from the old brass plate. And yet, the hinges remembered. The door opened with a sigh. Inside, time had yellowed the very air. Wooden mannequins stood like sentinels. Drawers overflowed with fabric samples that had not seen daylight in decades. In the center, a tall man with white hair and a threadbare waistcoat looked up from a ledger. "J.E. Firm," he said flatly. Poirot stepped forward. "But not to me." The man's eyes narrowed. "Poirot. Oh, and you are Marcel Devienne, are you not? Former secretary of the Guild of Needle and Blade." Devienne stood straighter. "That guild is dead." Poirot smiled faintly. "Like Henri Vallon." The air shifted. Devienne sat slowly, his gaze never leaving Poirot's. "You know." "I know that in 1894, a tailor was murdered here. And that Vallon, then barely 20, was a student in this very guild." Devienne tapped the desk once. It was hushed. Paid off. Buried with silk and silence. Poirot stepped closer. "And you think it stayed buried?" Devienne's voice dropped. "Henri knew something. Or someone believed he did. That's why he was killed. But it's not just about the murder. It's about the stitch." "The stitch?" Devienne opened a drawer and pulled out an old swatch of fabric. On it, a signature pattern. Not a name. A motif. A double-looped red thread that ended in a single drop. "The guild taught this," he said. "But only to the most senior cutters. It was called le point du sang. The blood stitch. Decorative. Symbolic. Used only for the final piece in a master's portfolio." Poirot took the fabric. "The jacket on Vallon used this stitch." Devienne nodded once. "Then the killer was a tailor." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Or one who learned from one." Back in his apartment, Poirot gathered the evidence on a wide drafting table. Photos. Swatches. Historical notes. But his focus kept drifting to one item, the cut measuring tape. Half of it had been missing at the crime scene. He stared at the remaining portion. The numbers ended at 23. He jotted the figure in his notebook. And remembered something. In the guild's old directory, there had been 24 senior apprentices listed in 1894. Only 23 had graduated. He flipped through the brittle pages of an archived copy. Names, hand-inked, marked with guild stamps. One name had been scratched out. Only the initial remained. Ah! He returned to Rue Sangliers in the early evening. The shop was sealed, but Poirot had authorization. He moved past the cutting table, into the back office. There, in Vallon's handwriting, he found an order log. Most pages were routine. Suits for weddings, uniforms for the opera. But the final entry, barely legible, stood out. Commission, R. 1894. Urgent. No fittings required. Poirot tapped the entry. No fittings, because the killer already knew the measurements. He leaned back, and had perhaps worn them before. That night, he made one final visit. To the Paris archives. There, among the yellowing case files, he found the 1894 death report, Etienne Leclerc, Tailor, deceased by submersion in red dye. A note had been appended. Accidental death, no charges filed. Witness testimony inconclusive. But Poirot found the witness list. And there, in small cursive, were the names. Henri Vallin, Marcel Devienne, Renaud Chazelle. 3 apprentices. Only 2 survived. And 1 had disappeared. Chazelle. He whispered the name aloud. Renaud Chazelle. R. 1894. The initials. The stitch. The jacket. Poirot stood, his voice barely audible in the echoing room. The killer is not avenging the past. He is finishing it. Morning brought with it a sharpened chill and an atmosphere tight with unsaid truths. The Parisian streets bustled as usual, but Poirot moved through them with the calm of a man threading a very fine needle. He held in his gloved hands 2 pieces of fabric, one from the crime scene, bearing the blood stitch, and another, the swatch from Devienne's archive. To the naked eye, they were identical. But Poirot's eyes were not naked. They were trained, precise, and constantly searching. He visited the atelier of Mme. Celeste Fournier, once the youngest guild mistress in Paris. Though now retired and legally blind, her fingers still knew the weight of thread like a violinist knows the strings. Poirot greeted her with warm respect. "Madame Fournier, I seek your hands more than your eyes." She laughed, a gentle rustle like silk in the wind. He placed both fabric swatches before her. 2 blood stitches, he said. Tell me which is older. She worked in silence, fingertips tracing the tiny loops and tension. Finally, she lifted one fragment. This one was sewn by a younger hand, she said. Impatient, but still trained. The second, she touched the other, was done with something else. Anger. Poirot raised a brow. You feel that? I feel everything. He bowed. Merci, madame. That is precisely what I suspected. Returning to his flat, Poirot pieced together a timeline of Renaud Chazelle's last known movements. There was nothing after 1894. No addresses, no records. But then, a small article in an old provincial newspaper surfaced. From 1902. Former Parisian tailor opens costume shop in Marseille. The photo was faded, but Poirot recognized the jawline. Chazelle, older, heavier, but it was him. The article mentioned a shop name, Masques et Miroirs. Poirot whispered to himself, the one who hides often wears a mask of mirrors. He made immediate arrangements. By afternoon, Poirot was en route to Marseille by train. The ride hummed steadily, rain streaking the window beside him. In his hand, he held Vallin's ledger again. One name kept recurring across different months. M. Alphonse Giraud, commission, antique repair, ceremonial garments. Poirot knew the name. A collector of rare textiles. And a known client of Chazelle's shop, before it was burned to the ground in 1908 under suspicious circumstances. Chazelle had disappeared again afterward. Another death in cloth. Poirot murmured, he does not kill for passion. He kills to preserve something. In Marseille, Poirot visited the ruins of Masques et Miroirs. It was now a bakery, the original structure lost, but the cellar remained. The proprietor allowed him below. In the dark, among crates of flour and wine, Poirot found it, an iron sewing machine, rusted but intact. And inside a small drawer, a notebook, initialed R.C. The pages contained sketches, outlines for suits. But not just any suits, reproductions of the blood-stitch portfolio, garment by garment. A portfolio that had never been completed in 1894. Chazelle had been rebuilding it, one piece at a time. And Henri Vallon had been the final thread. Poirot returned to Paris that night. There was no time to waste. He reviewed every known commission from Vallon's last month alive. 5 clients. 4 accounted for. 1 unclaimed, M. Rousseau, address false, no follow-up. But that wasn't the clue. The clue lay in the fabric. The suit Henri had been dressed in, Poirot now realized, it matched the measurements for Chazelle himself from a surviving order form from 1902. Chazelle had commissioned his own suit, and then placed it on the corpse of his rival. Poirot stood alone in his study, candlelight flickering. The final stitch was always meant to be worn by the ghost. Hercule Poirot, the Tailor of Blood Street Chapter 4, Stitch in the Silence narrated format, approx. 3,500 words. The wind that pressed against the shuttered windows of Paris that evening carried a brittle, unfamiliar quiet. It was not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows when something vital has slipped away, unseen. In his flat above the Rue des Capucines, Poirot stood in a tailored dressing robe, sipping dark coffee. The ledger was open before him, alongside the Marseille sketches and the faded photo from 1902. The pieces were falling into place, but one thread remained elusive. Why now? Why had Renaud Chazelle waited over 30 years to exact this theatrical justice? Poirot turned toward the window, where night blanketed the city in shadows stitched by streetlight. He tapped his finger on the armrest. Then he whispered, because something was completed. Or destroyed. At first light, Poirot returned to the Guild's archives, now maintained in a single narrow room at the rear of the City Museum. He requested access to the Guild of Needle and Blade's dissolution files. It was there he found the final audit, an inventory of tools, patterns, commissions left unfinished. One item was marked, Portfolio, R.C., withheld due to misconduct. And beneath it, a note in shaky penmanship. See sealed testimony, record 67B. Poirot requested the sealed record. Inside, a single sheet. Apprentice Chazelle accused of forging signatures on masterwork submissions. Guild expulsion recommended. No criminal charges filed due to lack of supporting evidence. Poirot leaned back. It was not merely rivalry, then. It was reputation. Humiliation. The blood stitch, a sacred symbol of excellence, had been denied to him. And now he had reclaimed it, through death. That evening, Poirot visited the home of M. Alphonse Giraud, the eccentric textile collector whose name had appeared so frequently in both Vallon's and Chazelle's past. Giraud received him in a salon overflowing with antique fabrics, mannequins, and wardrobes labeled in Latin. "Ah, Poirot," he said, motioning with a gloved hand, "I wondered when you would arrive. You knew I was coming. You are investigating blood, and I, as always, am surrounded by it. In thread, at least." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You were a client of Vallon's, and before that, of Chazelle." Giraud nodded. 2 artists. One disillusioned. One desperate. Poirot studied the room. In the corner stood a mannequin draped in a ceremonial robe, a masterwork embroidered in red. The stitch. Blood stitch. Poirot stepped forward. "You own the original." Giraud smiled. "It was delivered just days ago. No note. No sender. Only silence." Poirot's eyes swept the garment. It was perfect. Too perfect. He turned. "Giraud, I believe this was Chazelle's final piece. And that he delivered it not for admiration, but for absolution." Later that night, back in his apartment, Poirot stared at a map of Paris and Marseille. His finger moved between the two cities, plotting movement not just in space, but in time. Then his eyes landed on a second thread. the missing half of Valen's measuring tape. He searched the scene photographs again. It had not been found. But Poirot saw it, in the corner of the jacket's hemline, barely visible. It had been stitched inside the lining. A signature. A signature of the killer. Hidden in silence. By morning, Poirot was already on his way to the outskirts of the city, where a small hospice for the terminally ill stood hidden among rows of sycamores. The matron greeted him with sombre warmth. Yes, we had a man admitted under the name René Castel. Quiet. Dignified. He passed 3 nights ago. She handed him a box. His only possession, a tailor's kit. Inside were red thread, antique shears, and a journal. Poirot opened it. The final entry read, "Henri Valen was the last of them. The stitch is done. My work is whole. I will not need the mirror anymore." Poirot closed the journal and stood motionless for a long while. Then he whispered, "Even the bitterest tailor seeks the final thread of peace." And with that, Poirot left the hospice, the mystery nearly complete, though not quite concluded. The city of Paris, always a place of layered elegance and buried secrets, wore a slightly different expression in the days following Poirot's discovery. The quiet had not lifted, but shifted, no longer mysterious, but reflective. For while a crime may end, the echoes of intention, of design, continue to whisper through the spaces they inhabited. Poirot had solved the killing of Henri Valen in structure and motive. But something remained unfinished. Something that did not align. He reviewed the final journal entry once again. Henri Valen was the last of them. The stitch is done. My work is whole. Then why, he murmured, does it feel fragmented? Poirot paid a second visit to Marcel Devienne, the retired guild secretary. This time, his demeanor was sharper, more focused. "I require the names of every apprentice in your 1894 cohort," Poirot said. "Even the unofficial ones." Devienne hesitated. There were only 24. Poirot's voice hardened. "Non, monsieur. There were 25. But one was never registered, because he was never meant to pass." The old man's shoulders dropped. A charity case. The son of a domestic servant. His name was Luc Bellamy. Brilliant with his hands. But unstable. He was quietly dismissed after the Leclerc drowning. I assumed he disappeared. Poirot's gaze narrowed. You assumed incorrectly. Bellamy's trail led Poirot through records of mental health institutions. One note, handwritten in a psychiatrist's ledger, caught his eye. L.B. Obsession with symbolic perfection. Claims guilt not of murder, but of inheritance. Released under supervision, 1912. The address listed was a boarding house near the outskirts of Montparnasse. When Poirot arrived, it was long abandoned. Cracked paint, glass dust, the scent of mildew. But on the top floor, a room remained locked. He found the landlady, a woman with sharp eyes and a memory like parchment. Luc? Odd fellow. Came and went. Paid in cash. Sewed things at night. Loud machines. Left months ago. Left a trunk, though. Poirot opened the trunk carefully. Inside, garments. Dozens. Each folded with ceremonial precision. Each bearing a tag, RC and LB. Back in his flat, Poirot stared at the tags, the threads, the notebook. Chazelle had not worked alone. Bellamy, forgotten and dismissed, had become a silent partner in the execution of a design that began 30 years ago. Together, they had reconstructed the forbidden portfolio. Valen was the final name, but not the final stitch. Because the final piece was Giraud's robe. And it did not belong in a collection. It belonged in a tomb. That night, Poirot returned to Giraud's residence. This time, he carried a warrant. The collector was not surprised. You've come for the robe, he said quietly. Poirot nodded. You lied. You knew exactly who sent it. Because you requested it. Giraud hesitated. I was the sponsor. The last one. The only person who remembered the blood-stitch's value. I asked Chazelle to finish what the guild stole from him. Poirot's voice was calm but cold. And he did. With blood. You financed murder, Giraud. No. Giraud shouted. I financed justice. History. Poirot stepped closer. You financed vengeance stitched in silence. A tailor's legacy not preserved, but perverted. Giraud said nothing. Poirot turned to the robe. Its stitching shimmered in the low light. Even the most beautiful thread, he said, cannot bind a soul broken by pride. The police seized Giraud's artifacts. The robe was placed in evidence, the trunk from Bellamy's room catalogued and stored. The case of Henri Vallen's murder was officially closed. But Poirot knew the closure was not total. There had been 3 threads. Chazelle, whose hands had sewn the death. Bellamy, whose mind had shaped the design. And Giraud, who had held the needle that moved them both. Each guilty in a way the law cannot always measure. That evening, as Paris returned to its usual thrum, Poirot wrote the final entry in his casebook. The blood stitch was not merely embroidery, it was a wound that never healed. It is done now. But the cloth of human ambition, it tears easily and mends poorly. He closed the book, turned out the lamp, and let the silence settle. But this time, it was the silence of endings. The Parisian morning dawned with the solemn hush of mourning silks being drawn across old windows. Though the city bustled and moved, somewhere deep within its ancient veins, something cold and immovable lingered, like a seam sewn too tightly, tugging at all surrounding fabric. Poirot, now in possession of answers that even the police had not fully comprehended, sat quietly in his armchair, sifting through not evidence, but reflections. Justice had been done, or so the world would believe. But for Poirot, truth was not a stitched hem easily finished. It was a thread that frayed in memory, and tugged still. He was thinking of Bellamy, of how someone so forgotten could leave behind a pattern so haunting. He revisited the archives once more, not the police files, but the Museum of Decorative Arts. There, he requested a private viewing of the Guild of Needle and Blade's final exhibition, which had been displayed briefly before the Guild's dissolution in 1894. A quiet curator named Elise brought out the bound catalogue and a surviving box of swatches. This, she whispered, was their legacy. But one swatch was missing. Poirot looked up. Elise, may I see the entry list? She handed over a faded document. There it was. The name Luc Bellamy scrawled in pencil beneath the line. He had submitted a piece, illegally, under no number. Poirot turned the page. Beside Bellamy's entry, in the notes section, disqualified. Disturbing imagery. Hemline stitched with red knots resembling hanging limbs. He drew in a breath. Bellamy had embedded death in the hem, literal or symbolic. It had disturbed even the hardened judges. Back in his apartment, Poirot set the catalogue beside Giraud's confiscated robe, which he had requested under investigation protocol. He examined the lining. Carefully, using gloves and magnification, he followed the stitching. And there it was. 12 knots. Each different in pressure and direction. Each one marked with a thread slightly darker than the rest. It wasn't simply a flourish, it was a code. Poirot opened Bellamy's journal. On the final page, underneath the farewell, was a series of dots and slashes. He matched them to the knots. And read, "They wore me down, then wore me away." A final lament. Sewn not in paper, but in thread. Poirot visited the cemetery at Montmartre the following morning. The groundskeeper guided him to a modest grave, Lucien Bellamy, 1873 to 1932. There was no epitaph. Poirot stood for a long time, then placed a small silver pin at the foot of the grave, a needle forged from the Guild's final commission, preserved from the archives. "Your legacy is no longer silence," he whispered. "Even the forgotten deserve to be threaded into truth." Yet still, Poirot felt something missing. He returned to Rue Sangliers, to Valen's shuttered shop. Inside, dust had settled into stillness, but the patterns remained. A ghost of a chalk line still marked the last suit. Poirot followed the markings. There, on the collarfold, he found a final note stitched in red. RC was only the hand. LB was the soul. "Forgive me." HV. Henri had known. Perhaps even welcomed the end. Poirot stepped back. Henri's silence had been a penance. His death, a release. That night, Poirot did not write a final entry. Instead, he folded away the casebook. Not everything must be recorded, he thought. Some things are to be remembered only by those who saw the stitch unravel, who felt the cloth tear. Outside, Paris pulsed on. But inside, Poirot sat in stillness, wrapped not in silence, but in understanding. The air on Rue Sangliers was damp and disobedient, curling against the shutters of old stone facades like a whisper too long withheld. The house of Henri Valen, now sealed and forgotten by the world, waited under that grey sky with the patience only buildings possess, mute witnesses to histories far more terrible than their walls were ever meant to bear. Hercule Poirot stood before the narrow black door, its brass knob dulled by time and ash. The key, granted by the prefect following the case's conclusion, turned with an aged groan. And with that, Poirot stepped inside the tailor's final domain. Dust floated in tight spirals as he entered. Sunlight fought its way through gauzy curtains, casting long bars of gold onto parquet floors. The atelier had not been disturbed since the day Valen's body was discovered. Chalk outlines still ghosted across the measuring table. Pins glinted like forgotten thoughts in the floorboards. Poirot moved slowly, his gaze sweeping across bolts of fabric stacked in careful towers. Every item in its place. Precise. Methodical. Like the man who once commanded this space. Yet something felt misaligned. It was not disorder, but overorder. An obsessive tidiness that did not breathe. Poirot whispered, a space of mourning. Not of work. In the back corner of the atelier, he found a false wall. Barely perceptible, its grain ran differently from the others. With a slight push, it gave way. Behind it lay a room the size of a closet. Inside, shelves of thread, sketches, and a small writing desk. And there, atop a stack of folded parchment, sat a single item, a wooden box, lacquered in deep red, etched with the Guild crest. Poirot opened it. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to Renaud Chazelle. Each signed, H.V. They were dated intermittently over the past decade. Some a few sentences long. Others full pages. None had ever been sent. Poirot sat and read. You were always the fire. I, only the precision. I hated what they did to you. But I hated more what you became because of it. I cannot forgive you. Yet I keep your thread. I see you in every sleeve I shape. And finally, I know you are coming. I do not fear you. If this is the last stitch between us, let it be clean. Poirot exhaled slowly. Henri had not only anticipated his death. He had invited it. But why? Poirot searched the remaining shelves. One drawer in the desk creaked as he opened it. Inside, a photograph, faded, curling at the edges. It showed 3 men, young, suited. In front of the Guild's old doorway. Chazelle. Valen. And in the center, a third man. Luc Bellamy. Behind them, scrawled in ink, 1893. The beginning. Poirot stared. Not apprentices. Not yet. Friends. The tragedy was not merely in murder. It was in the slow unraveling of trust. That night, Poirot returned home with the letters. He laid them out chronologically and began cross-referencing dates with his case files. One entry stood out. A gap in the correspondence from 1911 to 1913. The same period Bellamy was institutionalized. When he re-emerged, the tone of Valen's letters shifted. They grew colder, more resigned. And then one line, written in 1921, burned Poirot's eyes. "I cannot stop Luke, but I can slow him." Poirot's thoughts raced. Valen had not only known Bellamy's intentions. He had worked to delay them, possibly to divert. But eventually, Chazelle had returned. And the final stitch had been made. Poirot made one final visit, to the guild ruins. Beneath the broken stone and ivy, the foundation of the original exhibition hall remained. He walked the perimeter until he found a spot in the northern wall where faint carving remained. "In stitch, we remember." Poirot knelt. He placed the photograph of the three young men beneath the arch. "Three ghosts," he whispered. "Threaded into time, into pride, into pain." The wind picked up slightly. Or perhaps something unseen exhaled. He stood and dusted off his coat. The house on Rue Sangliers had given up its final secret. And so, with the past honored and the pattern fully understood, Poirot turned toward the light. The fog settled over Paris with the softness of a burial shroud, clinging to the rooftops and the gaslights like a whisper left unfinished. In the heart of this spectral city, Hercule Poirot walked with purpose, the echo of each step a rhythmic reminder that though the murders had ceased, the story was not yet complete. The robe. It still sat in the evidence chamber. And something about its lining, the hue of its thread, called to him like a voice long ignored. Poirot returned to the forensics department with quiet urgency. The inspectors had long since moved on, declared the matter closed. But Poirot, never one to accept the unfinished, had asked for one more viewing of the robe. In a sealed box, under protective glass, it lay still and perfect. He examined the hem once more. There, in its elegant flourish, he saw it again, a sliver of crimson thread that did not match the rest. Thicker, more coarse. He requested the laboratory magnifier. Slowly, under its lens, the detail sharpened. What appeared at first to be a misaligned stitch revealed itself to be deliberate. It was writing. A name. L. Bellamy. Poirot's heart beat louder in his ears. The killer had not only signed the crime in blood, but with a stitch. He left the forensics room and walked through the city without a word, returning once more to Giraud's confiscated collection, now housed under lock and key by the Ministry of Cultural Heritage. Among the robes, the designs, the artifacts, he searched not for murder, but for identity. And in the margins of a leather-bound ledger, he found it. An entry. Commission accepted. Design approved by patron. Robe to be stitched in dual pattern, one visible, one silent. Client initials, G.R. Giraud, Poirot whispered. He wanted more than artistry. He wanted myth. Bellamy had delivered both. One pattern for the eye, one for the soul. Later that evening, Poirot sat alone in his flat, surrounded by swatches from the guild's archives. He arranged them in a mosaic. Each swatch bore a signature technique from the old masters. But one, retrieved from Valen's private drawer, was unique. It used a technique called the Crimson Whisper, a forbidden pattern designed to be visible only under angled light and precise magnification. Created to honor lost artisans. Only two people had ever mastered it. Chazelle and Bellamy. Yet the robe contained both techniques. Two hands, Poirot murmured, but one vengeance. Poirot called a private audience with the Prefect the following morning. He laid out the photographs, the threads, the coded hemline, the dual stitch patterns. This was not only murder, he said. It was a requiem. The Prefect frowned. And who is left to arrest, Poirot? No one, the detective replied. All three architects of the tragedy are dead. But their story lives. And that is the justice left to us. The Prefect nodded slowly, then signed the release for the robe to be sent to the National Museum, not as evidence, but as history. Weeks passed. Spring returned to Paris. Poirot walked the halls of the museum one morning, unnoticed, a quiet figure among marble and memory. In a side gallery, beneath soft light, the robe stood displayed on a headless mannequin. A plaque read, "The Crimson Whisper Robe, an unknown masterwork, discovered 1934. Believed to be the final piece by Renaud Chazelle. Dedicated anonymously." Poirot stepped closer. The hemline caught the light. There, only visible if one knew to look, a final stitch in faint crimson thread. "Forgive me." He stood for a long time, then turned and walked away. Paris, always a city of stories, now carried one more thread in its tapestry. And Poirot, as ever, had tied off its end. The museum was quiet as snowfall, its marble corridors dimly lit by high-placed sconces that cast their amber glow upon relics of lost eras. Between glass cases and velvet ropes, the mannequin stood, faceless, headless, clothed in the robe that had bound together so many lives in thread and blood. Poirot returned not as an investigator, but as a pilgrim. The Crimson Whisper robe had become more than evidence. It was now memory, curated and placed on display for strangers to pass, admire, and forget. But Poirot had not forgotten. And he did not come to admire. He came to listen. In the echoing stillness of the gallery, Poirot sat on a bench facing the robe. To others, it would appear he was observing fabric. But in truth, he was reading patterns. Not just in stitch, but in silence. It was then he noticed the positioning of the mannequin. Slightly askew. Not accidental. He rose. Circled. On the back seam of the robe, where it folded at the spine, there was an indentation beneath the thread. He alerted the curator. With gloved hands, they lifted the robe from the mannequin and revealed a small fold in the fabric lining, hidden in a tailor's blind tuck. Inside it, a slip of brittle paper. Poirot unfolded it carefully. A sketch. Faint, but unmistakable. It was not a design. It was a face. Poirot returned to his flat and laid out the drawing beside a series of old photographs, the guild apprentices, the suspects, the victims. The face in the sketch bore the long jaw of Bellamy, the brow of Vallin, and the eyes, unmistakably, of Chazelle. But it was none of them. It was a fourth man. Poirot's thoughts raced. Had they missed someone? He traced the museum acquisition records, which led him back to Giraud's personal archive. Among the forgotten boxes, he found an envelope labeled Archives, non-verified provenance. Inside were charcoal studies, student sketches from the guild's founding years. One, unsigned, showed the same face as the paper from the robe. Poirot searched the back. A name. Etienne Marchand. Not a known name. Not in the files. Not in the guild lists. He searched city records. And there it was. Etienne Marchand, 1871 to 1894. Died in workshop fire. Body never recovered. Presumed deceased. Poirot returned to the old guild building. Though in ruins, he sought out its blueprints at City Hall and located the records of the fire. The cause had never been confirmed. Some claimed sabotage. Others, accident. One archivist, an elderly woman with trembling hands, spoke quietly as she retrieved a brittle file. "It was the last exhibition," she whispered. "They say one apprentice, too ambitious, was denied entry. Lit a lamp in rage. The rest is ash." Poirot nodded. Etienne Marchand. Denied. Erased. But not forgotten. Because the robe carried his image. Not drawn by accident. But memorial. Poirot whispered, "Bellamy stitched this face into the hem of history." Back home, Poirot penned a private memorandum. The tale was never of 3 men. It was of 4. Valin, Chazelle, Bellamy, and Marchand. One dead in flame, one broken by flame, one vengeful by legacy. The 4th, Giraud, was merely the one who lit the final match. Poirot set the memo aside. The robe, he realized, was not just vengeance. It was a requiem. A haunted stitching of memory for a boy forgotten before he could be known. Later that night, Poirot visited the museum one final time. He stood before the mannequin, now fully aware of the shadow it cast. Not just cloth. Not just blood. But the memory of a boy who vanished in smoke. And whose brothers, twisted by silence, had spent 3 decades trying to stitch him back into the world. Even if it cost them their souls. Poirot bowed his head. Some mysteries are solved. Others are mourned. The city breathed in spring as if attempting to forget the long winter of silence and secrets. Paris had moved on, as cities do. But Hercule Poirot had not. His steps, measured and deliberate, took him one final time to the charred husk that was once the Guild of Needle and Blade. Etienne Marchand. The name whispered like wind through broken rafters. The boy without a grave. Poirot stood among the skeletal remains of the guild building, the wind carrying traces of sawdust and soot. Time had not erased the scent of fire. Beneath layers of ivy and moss, the stone bore faint scorch marks. Yet, even ruin held memory. From the city archives, he had recovered an original floor plan. One room had never been rebuilt, cordoned off after the fire. Poirot paced its edges, measuring with his cane. Then, carefully, he tapped the ground. Hollow. He called for the restoration office. Within days, a hidden subcellar was uncovered beneath layers of collapse. It contained what the records called the apprentice vault, a storage space where young artisans kept their experimental works. Inside, lit by lanterns and reverence, lay rows of charred mannequins, rolls of fabric turned to ash, and a metal trunk marked with a rusted plaque, E. Marchand. Poirot opened the trunk. Inside were burnt sketches, warped scissors, and a cracked leather notebook. Its pages, though blackened at the edges, remained legible. Etienne's handwriting flowed with youth, intensity, and heartbreak. I am not permitted to enter the exhibition. They say I am too bold. My design frightens them. They do not see that fire creates form. Renaud told me to wait. Valin said nothing. Luc wept. I lit the lamp not in anger, but to finish my piece. It was never meant to burn. Poirot stopped reading. So the fire had been an accident. Etienne had been painting with flame. And the guild had buried the truth in shame. The notebook's final entry chilled Poirot. If this is my last stitch, let them see me in red. I will be remembered not in breath, but in thread. He stared at the ashes in the trunk, then closed it gently. Etienne's legacy had not been forgotten. It had been sewn into every robe, every secret, every death. Poirot presented the notebook to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, along with the photo recovered earlier of the 4 friends. The curator listened with wide, glassy eyes. She asked if Poirot wished to have his name included in the exhibit. He declined. This is not my story, he said. It belongs to the forgotten. That evening, Poirot sat in his flat, firelight flickering over a quiet desk. He removed a small object from his pocket, a thimble, recovered from Etienne's trunk. On it, the initials EM scratched by a trembling hand. Poirot placed it atop his case file. The tailor's thread had run its course. But the fire remained, in memory, in sorrow, in truth. And sometimes, even justice wears ash. Paris, in its eternal elegance, resumed the rhythm of days untroubled by memory. But for Hercule Poirot, memory was the very substance of truth. As dawn bled through the lace of his apartment window, he stood before the mirror, trimming his mustache with the same precision with which he unravelled lives. The case of the tailor, the robe, the fire, the friends, it had reached its final seam. Yet he had one visit left to make. A modest cemetery lay in the outskirts of Montreal. It was quiet, not out of reverence, but out of being forgotten. Here, among cracked headstones and worn inscriptions, Poirot arrived at a new marble marker. Etienne Marchand 1871–1894. The fire did not silence you. He knelt and placed the thimble upon the grave. In his mind, he saw 4 boys laughing, sewing, dreaming. And then, the unraveling. Back in his apartment, Poirot began organizing the notes he would never publish. He sorted documents into a black dossier labeled simply, the Tailor case. It would remain sealed. To the world, the matter had been resolved. A string of revenge murders linked to a forgotten tailors' guild. But Poirot knew that to truly understand what had transpired was to descend into a seam of sorrow few could bear. The robe was no longer just art. It was elegy. The mannequins, once hollow, were now vessels of remembrance. Every murder in the case had followed a pattern, not just in method, but in message. Each stitch, each victim, mirrored a rejection, a silence, a betrayal. The real murderer. Pain. Passed from hand to hand, year to year, until someone, Luc, Renaud, Henri, finally turned it into something red. Poirot made a rare visit to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. The robe was now displayed beside Etienne's recovered notebook and the group photograph. A quiet plaque read, "In memory of the Guild of Needle and Blade. Its brilliance. Its silence. Its cost." A young boy stood before it, pointing. "Papa, what's that?" His father read aloud, "The Tailor of Blood Street." Poirot turned gently. "Say one histoire," he said softly. "A story in thread. The kind one must read with the heart." As the crowd drifted, Poirot lingered. The robe seemed to pulse with memory. He felt, for just a moment, that Etienne stood beside him. Not in vengeance, but in peace. Poirot bowed his head. Some cases end with applause. Others, with silence. This one ended with remembrance. And so, with the hem fully stitched, Hercule Poirot turned toward the door. The ghosts had spoken. And the tailor, at last, could rest. And so, with the case of the tailor on Blood Street closed, Hercule Poirot once again proves that nothing escapes those little grey cells. Behind every stitch was a secret, and behind every smile, a motive. But not all mysteries end so neatly, and not all streets are so quiet when night falls. Was justice truly served, or simply well dressed? Thought Balloon, what did you think? Was there more to this mystery than even Poirot saw? Pushpin, if you enjoyed the case, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon for more mysteries unraveled in the shadows.